Claire Morrison had always found a gentle rhythm in her quiet life, nestled in the pine-lined hills of Northern California. Once a beloved elementary school teacher, she had taken a break from the classroom a year ago, choosing instead to work remotely, writing educational content for publishers and learning platforms. Her cozy cedarwood home, tucked just beyond the curve of a gravel road, was a sanctuary of soft light, quiet hours, and the comforting shuffle of paws across hardwood floors. Shadow and Maple, her two German shepherds, were more than just pets. They were her companions, her shadows in the truest sense, each with their own quiet temperament. Shadow, the older of the two, moved like a sentinel, careful, watchful. Maple, younger and gentler, followed Claire from room to room with a kind of silent devotion. For months her days passed with a calm predictability, typing at her desk by the sunlit window, taking long walks beneath the towering firs, sipping chamomile tea as the mountains faded into dusk. It was a life of small, steady joys. And then, one bright summer morning, a car pulled into the driveway, and everything began to shift. Claire opened the front door to find her 8-year-old niece, Sophie, standing there with a small polka-dot backpack hanging from one shoulder and a hesitant smile clinging to her lips. Her sister Madison waved from the driver's seat, mouthing a thank you before backing down the driveway. "Hi, sweetheart," Claire said warmly, stepping forward to greet her niece. "Come on in." Sophie stepped over the threshold slowly, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. She wasn't giggling or bouncing with excitement the way Claire remembered from their video calls. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, almost too careful for a child her age. And then almost immediately, Shadow and Maple approached. Claire had expected the usual tail wagging, the playful rush of excitement her dogs showed toward guests, especially children. But today, there was none of that. Only tension. But instead, both dogs slowed as they neared Sophie. Their bodies tensed, ears perked high, eyes sharp and unreadable. Shadow sniffed cautiously near Sophie's shoes, then moved to stand in front of her, unmoving. Maple positioned herself at Sophie's side, close, closer than necessary. Claire forced a small chuckle. "They're just curious," she said, crouching down to meet Sophie's eyes. "They remember you from the holidays." But the air had shifted, subtly but certainly. The dogs weren't excited, they were alert. Sophie said nothing, only gave a small, almost apologetic smile before crouching beside her bag to unzip it and pull out a worn coloring book and a small stuffed rabbit. Shadow and Maple settled beside her like sentinels, their bodies forming a quiet circle around the child. Claire stood there watching, a strange unease beginning to ripple beneath the calm surface of her thoughts. Something was different this time, something she couldn't quite name. By the second day, Claire began to notice the quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy. Sophie, who used to chatter excitedly during their video calls, now drifted silently through the house, like a whisper trying not to be heard. She moved with a kind of invisible weight, as if each step required careful thought. Even when Claire made her famous cinnamon French toast that Sophie had once declared better than Mom's, the girl only offered a faint "thank you" before retreating to the living room with her plate untouched. Claire tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe Sophie needed time to adjust. But the look in the child's eyes, watchful, hesitant, almost haunted, told another story. Shadow and Maple seemed to sense it too. Wherever Sophie went, the dogs followed. When she sat on the floor by the coffee table to color, they flanked her. When she walked into the hallway, they padded just behind her heels. Even when she paused at the window to stare out at the trees, a habit that was becoming more and more frequent, they stood still beside her, ears perked, eyes scanning the yard as though expecting something to appear. Claire started watching Sophie more closely, and what she saw unsettled her. The girl hardly spoke. When she did, it was barely louder than a breath. She arranged her dolls in perfect circles and whispered to them like they held secrets. She often sat cross-legged on the rug, shoulders curled inward, her eyes drifting toward corners of the room that held nothing but stillness. One afternoon, Claire caught her standing by the window for the third time that day. The sunlight washed over Sophie's small frame, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Her gaze was fixed, not on the flowers or the trees, but on something just beyond them, something Claire couldn't see. "Sweetheart," Claire said gently from across the room, "is everything okay?" Sophie turned slowly. Her expression didn't change much. There was no visible fear, no tears, no tantrum. Just that same quiet restraint, like she was trying not to take up too much space. She gave a tiny nod, eyes dipping away as she mumbled, "I'm fine." Claire wanted to believe her. She really did. But her instincts, finely honed from years of working with children, told her something wasn't fine at all. Back in the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, arms folded tightly across her chest. From where she stood, she could see Sophie on the living room rug, arranging her dolls again. Shadow lay at her side, letting out a low, rhythmic huff, while Maple pressed her chin into Sophie's lap as if to say, "I'm here. I see you." Claire didn't know what was wrong yet, but she knew her dogs, and they didn't behave like this without a reason. Something was bothering Sophie, and Shadow and Maple weren't leaving her side until they figured out what. The house had always been quiet, but now it felt like it was holding its breath. Claire watched Sophie from across the room, pretending to scroll through her tablet while keeping her eyes on the little girl curled up on the rug. The child didn't make much noise, just the soft rustle of pages from her coloring book, the occasional creak of the floorboards when she shifted position. No humming, no playful laughter, no spontaneous chatter about unicorns or school friends. Just stillness. Even when Claire tried to pull Sophie into small conversations, the girl offered only soft, guarded replies. Yes, no, I don't know. She never looked directly at Claire for long, as if worried her gaze might give something away. Claire had taught hundreds of children. She knew the difference between shyness and withdrawal, and this was not just shyness. Sophie's silence felt rehearsed. Each day followed a similar rhythm. Claire would make breakfast, often adding little smiley faces in the pancakes or arranging strawberries into flowers. Sophie would offer a polite thank you, then sit quietly, pushing her food around more than eating it. When Claire suggested going outside to play or walk the dogs, Sophie hesitated every time, before finally agreeing with a small nod. But once they stepped into the open, Sophie stayed close, barely letting go of Claire's hand. Her eyes constantly scanned the streets, the trees, the fences. Shadow and Maple noticed too. They had become extensions of her now, never more than a few feet away. It wasn't just companionship, it was protection. The way Shadow always positioned himself between Sophie and the front door. The way Maple would press close to Sophie's legs when a car passed too quickly on the road. It was as if they could feel her anxiety pulsing in the air. One afternoon, Claire watched from the hallway as Sophie knelt by the window, her coloring book forgotten beside her. She was whispering again, words too soft to make out, to the little stuffed rabbit that rarely left her arms. Her lips barely moved, but her fingers fidgeted constantly with the worn ribbon tied around the toy's neck. Shadow sat beside her like a statue, unmoving except for the occasional flick of his ears. Maple rested her head on Sophie's thigh, eyes half-lidded but alert. The scene was heartbreakingly gentle and impossibly heavy. Claire didn't want to push. She knew too well how children closed off when they sensed pressure. But her worry had taken root now, deep in her chest, branching into questions she couldn't yet answer. What had made Sophie so small inside herself? And why did her dog seem to understand it even before she did? Claire stepped back, leaning against the hallway wall, letting the quiet fill the space between them. She didn't know how to fix it, not yet, but she would wait and watch and listen, because that's what Sophie needed. Even the loudest pain sometimes arrives in silence. The stillness of the house at night was something Claire used to cherish. She'd often stay up an hour or two after Sophie went to bed, sipping herbal tea while the soft hum of crickets filled the air just outside the window. Shadow and Maple usually curled at her feet or sprawled across the rug, their breathing slow, their presence grounding. But that night was different. It was just past midnight. Claire sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, a worn paperback resting open in her lap, untouched. Her tea had gone cold. Upstairs, Sophie slept in the guest room, tucked beneath the quilt Claire had sewn last winter. Then, without warning, Shadow bolted upright. His ears were rigid. His entire body froze. Maple followed instantly, rising like a shadow come alive. Both dogs moved as one, a quiet urgency in their steps as they stalked toward the front door, muscles taut beneath their fur. Claire sat up straight, heart suddenly racing. "What is it?" she whispered, standing slowly. Shadow let out a low, sharp bark that shattered the silence. Maple's growl joined it, low and rising. They stood planted in front of the door, their eyes focused like lasers on something outside, something Claire couldn't see. The porch light flicked on automatically as Claire stepped closer. She hesitated only a second before peeking through the peephole. Nothing. The street lay empty, bathed in the soft yellow cast of the street lamp. The trees at the edge of her yard rustled gently in the night breeze. The driveway was quiet, her car still, the fence untouched. Still, Shadow and Maple didn't move. They stood perfectly still, vibrating with energy, their growls low but insistent. Claire's fingers hovered over the lock, her throat tightening. "There's nothing there," she murmured almost to herself. She placed a hand on Shadow's back. His muscles were tight, trembling beneath her touch. Maple's tail was stiff, body angled toward the door like she was preparing to defend. For 10 minutes they held their position. Claire stood behind them, frozen in place, her mind looping through possibilities. Had someone walked past? A raccoon? A deer? But no, this wasn't their reaction to random animals or distant noises. Shadow and Maple were trained, disciplined. They never barked at shadows. Only when Claire relocked the deadbolt and turned off the porch light did the dogs reluctantly back away. Even then, they didn't relax. They lay down by the door, heads on their paws, eyes fixed on the entrance with the intensity of soldiers keeping watch. Claire sat down beside them, heart still pounding. She reached for her forgotten tea but didn't drink. Whatever it was, they'd felt it, and it hadn't come to say hello. The next morning, as Claire opened the front curtains to let in the light, she spotted Mrs. Ellery, her elderly neighbor from 2 houses down, standing just beyond the picket fence, watering her dahlias. Claire stepped outside, coffee in hand. "Good morning." Mrs. Ellery looked up, her brow furrowed. "Morning, Claire. I was actually about to come knock." Claire tilted her head, curious. "Everything okay?" The older woman glanced toward Claire's front porch, then lowered her voice just slightly. "I saw a few boys, teenagers maybe, walking through your yard around midnight. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but they weren't just passing by. They slowed down right near your porch." Claire's stomach dropped. "They didn't come to the door or anything," Mrs. Ellery added, "but they lingered. Long enough for Shadow to notice, I'm guessing." Claire nodded slowly, the unease from the night before settling in deeper. "Thanks for telling me," she said. "I thought something felt off." Mrs. Ellery offered a small, tight smile. "Trust those dogs of yours, dear. They know before we do." Afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the porch and the hum of summer stirred in the trees, Claire decided it was time to try something, anything to lift the quiet fog that had settled over Sophie. She walked into the living room where Sophie was curled up with her coloring book, Shadow and Maple flanking her like a living barrier. "Hey," Claire said, her voice light and warm. "How about we take a little walk down to the ice cream shop? They've got sprinkles, chocolate chips, and waffle cones that taste like cookies." Sophie hesitated. She didn't look up at first. Then slowly she nodded. Just once. Claire offered her hand. Sophie stood, taking it wordlessly. Shadow and Maple followed without being called, falling into place like bodyguards escorting royalty. The four of them stepped into the soft warmth of the afternoon sun and started down the sidewalk. Claire let Sophie set the pace. The child's grip was firm, too firm for someone heading towards something as simple as ice cream. Shadow walked slightly ahead, ears turning like tiny radar dishes. Maple kept herself positioned between Sophie and the road, her steps deliberate. At the little shop on the corner, Claire let Sophie choose whatever she wanted. She picked vanilla with strawberry drizzle and rainbow sprinkles. When she took the first bite, Claire saw something flicker across her face. A spark, small but real. It lasted only a second, but it was the first time in days Claire saw something childlike break through the surface. Afterward, they wandered across the street to a nearby park. Children laughed in the open field, their voices rising and falling in bursts of joy. The grass glowed gold under the sun, and for a brief moment, Claire allowed herself to hope this was helping. Sophie wandered quietly toward the playground, still holding her cone. Claire sat on a shaded bench nearby, Shadow and Maple resting at her feet. She watched Sophie from a distance, alone but not lonely, cautious but moving. Then she saw them, a small group of older boys on bicycles circling the far edge of the park. They weren't yelling or causing trouble, but the way they circled the park felt too practiced, too knowing. Their eyes didn't just wander, they locked on Sophie, like they were waiting for something. Claire sat up straighter, her hand reflexively resting on Maple's back. Something about the way the boys looked at Sophie made her skin crawl. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. Shadow's ears perked up. Maple's body stiffened, head lifting. Both dogs stared at the boys with quiet intensity. Claire followed their gaze. One of the boys nudged another, whispered something, and laughed. Their eyes lingered on Sophie too long as they passed. Sophie didn't run. She didn't scream. She just stood there, holding her cone, eyes low, shoulders slightly folded inward. The moment passed, but its weight lingered. On the walk home, Sophie didn't eat the rest of her ice cream. Her free hand clutched Claire's tighter than ever before. Every few steps, she looked back over her shoulder. The boys were gone, but their presence clung to the air like the fading echo of something that wasn't done yet. And Shadow and Maple stayed closer than ever, silent, unwavering, watching. The house was quiet again. After they returned from the park, Claire helped Sophie out of her shoes and wrapped her in the soft fleece blanket that had become a constant companion on the couch. She placed the half-melted ice cream cone in the trash and tried not to dwell on how quickly the brightness had faded from Sophie's face. Shadow rested his head gently on Sophie's lap, while Maple curled at her feet, her body stretched protectively across the length of the couch. Claire sat beside her, unsure of what to say, only sure that something needed to be said. She glanced at Sophie, who was staring down at the frayed edges of the blanket, her fingers moving in tiny circles against the fabric. The child's posture had changed, her shoulders low, her chin tucked, as if trying to make herself disappear into the couch cushions. Claire took a slow breath. "Sophie," she said softly, "is someone being unkind to you?" The words hung in the air, delicate and sharp. Claire didn't push, didn't prompt, just let the question settle between them. For a long moment, Sophie didn't move. Then ever so slightly, her small frame shifted. Her shoulders rose and fell in a breath that was barely there. She didn't look up, but in the faintest whisper she answered, "They say mean things when no one's around." Claire's heart clenched. She kept her voice steady. "Who does?" Sophie shook her head, eyes glassy but dry. Some of the kids. She paused. Her hands gripped the blanket tighter. I didn't want to tell, she added. I thought it would stop. Claire reached across the space between them, laying her hand gently over Sophie's. You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. Her voice cracked, but she didn't pull away. You didn't do anything to deserve that, and you're not alone anymore, okay? I'm here. I'm listening. As if on cue, Shadow nudged his head closer against Sophie's arm. Maple shifted slightly, pressing her body even closer, like a wordless promise. We've got you. Sophie didn't say anything else, but the silence now felt different. Less like fear, more like relief. Like something long buried had finally found its way to the surface. Claire leaned back slightly, wiping a quiet tear from the corner of her eye. This wasn't just a rough patch. It wasn't about shyness or homesickness or settling in. It was fear. And now that it had a name, Claire knew. This couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be explained away. It had to be faced. No matter how quietly it had arrived, this pain was real, and Claire would not let it stay in the dark any longer. The days that followed felt fragile, like walking across a frozen lake, uncertain where the cracks might lie beneath. Sophie stayed close, rarely more than a few steps from Claire or from Shadow and Maple, who remained her ever-present guardians. She spoke a little more, but only in whispers, and only when she felt safe. Usually when her hand rested on Shadow's thick coat, or when Maple gently nudged her leg under the table. Claire knew this wasn't sustainable, so one morning over breakfast, she offered a new idea. I was thinking, she said casually, watching Sophie's spoon stir her cereal. Maybe we could invite a few kids over this weekend, just in the backyard. Some games, snacks, nothing big. Sophie froze for a second. Then she looked up, uncertain. Do I have to? Only if you feel ready, Claire said gently, and I'll be there the whole time. So will Shadow and Maple. Sophie didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she gave a small nod. That Saturday, the backyard slowly came to life with the laughter and chatter of children. Claire had strung up a few colorful paper lanterns and laid out picnic blankets, juice boxes, and bowls of pretzels. A folding table held a stack of puzzles, board games, and watercolor paints. Sophie stayed close to the house at first, eyes darting with every new arrival. Shadow lay at her feet like a stone guardian, while Maple moved wherever she did, tail low but alert. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like a normal children's gathering, low-key, cheerful, but Claire saw the truth beneath the surface. She saw how Sophie's smiles never quite reached her eyes, how her body remained tight, her arms always close to her chest. Still, there were small victories. Sophie spoke to two girls about a puzzle. She even laughed, just once, during a game of catch when one boy tripped over a lawn chair. Claire stood near the snack table, pretending to be engrossed in conversation with another parent, but her eyes never left Sophie. And then she saw them. A small cluster of older boys and girls had gathered near the back fence. Kids Claire recognized immediately. They were the same ones from the park, not loud, not confrontational, just watching. One boy nudged another, a whisper, a snicker. Claire saw it. So did Shadow. His ears shot up instantly. Maple stood beside him, tail stiff, body angled forward in silent warning. Sophie's posture changed. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes dropped to the grass, and then quietly she slipped away, past the snack table, behind the tall hedges at the edge of the yard. Claire's heart dropped. She moved quickly, following the soft rustle of leaves and the faint sound of paws. Behind the hedge, she found Sophie curled near the base of a tree, her knees pulled tight to her chest, cheeks flushed and eyes red. Shadow paced in a slow circle around her. Maple sat beside her, head pressed gently against Sophie's shoulder, as if to say, "I see you. I'm sorry the world doesn't." Claire knelt and wrapped an arm around her trembling frame. "They were staring again," Sophie whispered. Claire didn't ask who. She already knew. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly. And she meant it. That evening, after the last of the folding chairs had been stacked and the string lights dimmed, Claire sat on the front porch beside her sister Madison. Sophie had gone to bed early, emotionally drained, curled up under her favorite quilt, with Maple nestled against her legs in shadow keeping guard by the door. The air was still warm, but there was a sharp edge to the silence between the two women. Claire turned her teacup slowly in her hands, the ceramic cool against her fingers. "I think it's time to talk to the other parents," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. Madison nodded slowly. "If we don't say something now, it'll keep happening, just quieter." Claire glanced toward the upstairs window, where a faint sliver of light glowed from Sophie's room. "We can't let her carry this alone," she whispered. The next evening, Claire opened her home to 4 neighborhood families. It wasn't a formal meeting. There were no accusations, no pointed fingers, just tea, quiet music, and a deep ache Claire was finally ready to put into words. Sophie sat quietly on the stairs, out of sight but not out of earshot. Shadow and Maple flanked her on either side, silent sentinels guarding the space between her hurt and the adult world below. Claire stood in the middle of the room, her hands trembling slightly, but when she spoke, her voice held. "She used to sing when she brushed her hair," she began. "She used to talk to her stuffed animals like they were best friends. She used to run to the door when someone knocked." A pause, a breath. "Now, she barely looks up when she hears footsteps. She doesn't speak unless she feels completely safe. And yesterday I found her hiding behind a hedge, crying, because someone smirked